Sir Cedric was the kind of knight who became legend in his own time, honorable, unmatched in battle, and guided by a code as rigid as the blade he carried. His name was synonymous with loyalty, his presence a sign of hope for the realm. But even heroes are not immune to the traps of fate. During a war council, Cedric was faced with a cruel choice: protect a defenseless village on the brink of an enemy attack or secure his army, essential for the kingdom's defense. Logic demanded a strategic answer. Cedric chose the army. That night, the village was consumed by flames. From atop a distant hill, Cedric watched as houses turned to ash and the screams of innocence pierced his soul like daggers. The following day, his army won the battle, but the victory rang hollow. The honor he once cherished now felt cracked. Though the people praised him as a hero, something inside him had broken. It was then, in the solitude of a dense forest, that she appeared, wired, the personification of fate, with eyes too ancient for such a serene face. She didn't scream or accuse, she simply spoke the truth. Cedric's decision hadn't been only duty, but pride. As punishment, she cast a curse. His strength would slowly fade. His mind would be corroded by doubt, and his once unshakable honor would weaken. His descendants would suffer the consequences. Cedric fell to his knees. The invincible knight now trembled like an autumn leaf. In ruins, he renounced his title, apologized to his wife and children, and wandered aimlessly, in search of answers, unrecognizable to anyone who once hailed him as a hero. One day, an old man offered him a meal out of kindness. Upon hearing Cedric's story, he handed him a map, saying it was a path others had followed long ago when facing similar curses. With the map in hand, Cedric made a decision. He would seek redemption, even if the road ahead was uncertain. Cedric left without looking back. The map given to him by the old man trembled in his hands, filled with enigmatic symbols and faded routes. Each step took him further from the knight he once was, and closer to a fate yet unknown. The lands he crossed seemed forgotten by the world. Dense forests whispered ancient secrets. Inhospitable mountains loomed like silent judges. In taverns and by campfires, Cedric heard tales of a cursed knight, his own story already spreading like smoke in the wind. Some versions were kind, others merciless, but they all ended with the same warning: the path to redemption is harsher than the road to war. After days of travel, he found a small chapel hidden deep in the forest. Inside, among dusty scrolls, one caught his attention, not because it spoke directly of him, but because it described a night marked by a dark fate, driven by a curse. The coincidences were too many. It felt like a distorted reflection of his own life, a veiled warning. The prophecy spoke of 3 trials, of the mind, the soul, and the spirit. In the corner of the scroll, a hastily drawn map pointed to the next destination, the Forest of Illusions, a place where truth hides, behind lies, and the past cannot be trusted. Cedric shivered. It wasn't a direct summons, but the omen was unmistakable. The entrance to the Forest of Illusions looked ordinary. Tall trees, leaf-strewn paths, the soft whisper of wind. But Cedric quickly sensed something was wrong. The light seemed to vanish between the branches. Time slowed. The air, though calm, carried an invisible weight. This forest was not made of mere wood and moss. It was made of memories. The first illusions came subtly, a forgotten perfume, the sound of a child's laughter. Cedric saw, between the trees, glimpses of his childhood, his home, his mother, quiet afternoons before the war. When he reached out to touch that old life, it dissolved. The forest showed not what was, but what could have been. Soon the visions turned cruel. Fallen comrades, villages covered in ash, empty eyes silently asking, "Why not us?" Cedric tried to resist, but the forest knew every crevice of his guilt. It was as if each tree held a regret, each shadow an old mistake. But the more he tried to flee the illusions, the more they chased him. Then he understood. The way forward wasn't resistance, it was confrontation. Cedric stopped fighting the visions and began listening to them. He acknowledged his pain, admitted his failures, looked into the eyes of the ghosts without trying to erase them. And so, the forest changed. The shadows grew lighter. The whispers faded. Cedric didn't emerge unscathed. The pain remained, alive, but he came out more whole. He had not conquered the forest. He had learned to walk with it. As he stepped beyond the trees, the sun greeted him for the first time in days. He didn't know how long he had been inside, but one thing was certain. He had passed the first trial, and more than that, he had reclaimed a piece of himself he thought was lost. The next path led Cedric to a remote valley where a narrow, ancient wooden bridge stretched across a seemingly bottomless abyss. There was no wind there, no sound, only the creak of the planks beneath the feet of those who dared to cross. It was a place forgotten by time, where every stone and rope seemed laden with meaning. The Bridge of Sacrifice. And the name was no metaphor. As he stepped onto the wood, Cedric felt a pressure in his chest, as if something unseen was squeezing his heart. The bridge was more than a physical crossing. With every step, ancient voices echoed in his mind. Memories, not all his own, intertwined with his. Cries of battle, broken promises, unspoken guilt. He was stepping into a realm where the spirit was tested more than the body. At the center of the bridge, a figure wrapped in shadows awaited him. It had no face, only eyes that glowed like embers. In one hand, a scale. In the other, a sword. Cedric understood without a word. To move forward, something had to be left behind. He considered his pride, his honor, even his longing for redemption. But deeper still was something more rooted, a silent bitterness. He still carried anger toward those who judged him, those who abandoned him, and perhaps in some way toward himself. That anger was what kept his soul from moving freely. At that moment, Cedric knelt, not as one who surrenders, but as one who understands. In a low voice, he released forgiveness to his enemies, to those who failed him, and most of all, to himself. The scale tilted. The bridge, once unstable, grew firm beneath his feet. The shadowed figure vanished like smoke in the wind. Cedric rose. As he crossed the remaining length of the bridge, he felt something inside him shift. A weight had been lifted. And though the journey ahead remained dangerous, it now felt just a little lighter. The mountains beyond the bridge were barren and silent. Cedric traveled alone, but the emptiness around him seemed to mirror something deeper, the lack of purpose that settles in when all is lost. It was in this desolate setting that the ambush happened. 3 figures emerged from the rocks, 2 men and 1 woman armed and alert, moving through the shadows in perfect sync. Cedric tried to resist, but his reflexes were no longer what they once were. When he fell to his knees, there was no final blow, only questions. They knew him, not from battle, but from whispers, from legends, the cursed knight. They weren't bandits. They were like him, exiled by fate, condemned by forces beyond their control. One of them, Lothar, was a wall of flesh and steel, cursed with a strength that destroyed everything he touched. Isolde, the sharp-eyed archer, could never love without bringing ruin. And Alaric, the old mage, bled from within every time he dared to use magic. 3 stories, 3 wounds, 1 shared quest, liberation. They called themselves the Order of the Exiled. Cedric was welcomed with suspicion, but also with a strange empathy. Over time, mistrust gave way to quiet exchanges by the fire. There was a silent intimacy among them, not in words, but in shared scars. The alliance formed without solemn vows. It was a union of tired souls, held together by a fragile yet real hope. Together, perhaps they had a greater chance. Alone, they were merely ghosts wandering a world that had already forgotten them. When they consulted the map again, a new destination awaited, a place where past and identity merged in a living labyrinth. But for the first time, Cedric would not walk alone, and that in itself already felt like a small victory. The group walked toward the partially open stone gates. Before them stood the labyrinth of memory, a place where space and time bent to the will of the past. There were no walls visible at first, but the moment they crossed the threshold, each was pulled into a separate path, as if the labyrinth knew them, splitting them apart like fingers of the same hand. Lothar, the silent giant, was led down a dark corridor that seemed to close around him, the walls tightening in response to his overwhelming strength. Isolde, the archer, was drawn into a narrow path where shadows danced along the edges. Alaric, the aged mage, disappeared into a golden mist. Cedric fell into a spiraling hallway without light or clear direction. The walls, alive and pulsing, began to reveal fragments of lives that weren't his, loves of strangers, the grief of forgotten kings, memories so vivid they hurt. He felt them, he wept for them, and for a moment he believed he had lived each of those lives. It was as if he carried not only his own story, but the pain of the world. The confusion began to shift into understanding. The labyrinth wasn't a trap. It was like walking through a collective mirror. The memories weren't just echoes of the past. They were threads of lives interwoven, an ancestral quilt stitched with pain, bravery, and endurance. Each memory revealed that suffering was not unique, but a universal language that everyone learns to speak. He saw warriors, mothers, beggars. Each one fought, each one fell, and each, somehow, continued on. Cedric began to walk with less fear. He no longer heard the voices as torment, but as guidance. Each memory became a whispered lesson, and in the heart of the labyrinth, he found a vast chamber where all stories intertwined in a web of light and shadow. There he understood redemption was not a solitary road. When he reunited with his companions at the exit, their eyes had changed. A heavy, respectful silence passed between them. Each had returned with something more, or something less. No one asked what the others had seen, and no one needed to. Outside, the world looked clearer. Their next destination awaited, but inside, something had already changed. The next path led Cedric and his companions to a forgotten valley, surrounded by silent black mountains. At its center stood a crumbling fortress, still imposing despite the wear of ages, as if it had been waiting for them. According to the map, this was where the last Guardian resided, and with him, a truth none of them were ready to face. They walked through cold, dark corridors until they reached a vast chamber where the air was heavier than the silence itself. At the center, wrapped in living shadows, stood the Guardian. He was not beast nor man, but something in between, eyes like burning coal, and a voice that seemed to come from every corner at once. He did not challenge them with weapons, but with words. He revealed to Cedric that his curse was only the surface. There was something older, an ancestral pact sealed by Cedric's forebears with word, a bargain of power in exchange for a future price, the souls of their descendants. When Cedric chose duty over compassion, he had triggered the ancient pact. His curse wasn't merely punishment, it was inheritance. The ground seemed to fall away beneath his feet. Everything he thought he bore alone was, in truth, part of a long-standing debt. His personal guilt tangled with a dark legacy. Redemption, then, was not just freedom. It was the breaking of a generational chain. The Guardian offered him a choice. Cedric could accept his fate and carry the curse to his grave, sparing the others from risk. Or he could face Wyrd directly and try to undo the pact, knowing the battle could destroy not only himself, but everyone around him. He looked at his companions. None spoke a word. but their eyes said everything. They were with him. To the very end, Cedric turned to the Guardian with a heavy heart but a steady voice. The ancestral pact would end with him, or with his final breath. The final trail led them to the peak of a sacred mountain, where the veil between the world of men and the realm of fate was thin as morning mist. The climb was harsh, cutting, winds, biting snow, the weight of centuries on their shoulders. Cedric led the way, guided not only by the map, but by a silent urgency to free all bound to his lineage. At the summit, before an altar carved into the stone itself, Wyrd awaited them. Majestic and still, her presence filled the air like a storm on the verge of breaking. She looked at Cedric as though reading his intent before he could speak. There was no mockery, only a single question. Did he truly believe he could sever a thread woven by fate? Cedric did not hesitate. He did not seek to change the past, only to keep its weight from crushing the future. Wyrd tested him one last time. He could take the curse upon himself and free all others, or he could fight to break the pact, risking everything, including the lives of those who stood by him. Cedric looked to the Order. In their eyes there was no fear, only acceptance. He no longer carried the burden alone. The battle that followed transcended the physical. Blades clashed, but so did memories. Every strike unveiled buried pain. Each step demanded the courage not only to fight, but to accept what had been lost. Wyrd was relentless, the merciless reflection of every choice left unmade. In the final moment, Cedric dropped his sword, not out of defeat, but conviction. He offered his life as the final seal, not as a martyr, but as a man free of vanity. In return, he asked only that Wyrd release his bloodline, his companions, and all others still trapped by the invisible chain. Wyrd, surprised by the purity of the sacrifice, accepted. The curse dissolved like mist in the wind. Cedric fell, exhausted but at peace. His companions gathered around him. Alaric whispered a prayer. Iseult gently closed his eyes. Lothar remained silent, guarding him with his gaze. There, atop the world, Cedric drew his final breath. He was buried in his homeland, under the respect of a people who only now understood his true greatness. The Order of the Exiled continued their mission, no longer as the condemned, but as bearers of new hope. And the legend of Cedric, the knight who defied fate, echoed through the ages like a song that never fades.